Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to St Mary's Barnes. And it's Andrew Summers, the chairman of the Friends of St Mary's Barnes. And I don't know how many book events we've done with Bishop Richard Harris over the years, but it's a great pleasure to be able to do it for him and for Barnes and for a wider community, and especially this latest book, Wounded I Sing. And it's very appropriate because it's designed to be 24 poems for the 4 weeks of Advent, which is starting in 10 days' time, no, 2 weeks' time. We're very pleased that Venerable Sheila Watson is joining us to talk with Richard about it. Sheila, welcome back. You may remember Sheila from when she spoke at a Friends Call Evensong a few years ago anyway. And it's very good to welcome you back. So, over to you. Well, I should say firstly, of course, that at the end, then Richard would be happy to sign the books that you're buying from Barnes Bookshop, and he'll sign them over there, and there will be drinks still available at the back. So, over to you.
Andrew, thank you. Can I say, can everyone hear all right? Yes. Great. It's lovely to come back and to join with you, and it's a particular treat to join Richard at this point. I was thrilled to see that it was George Herbert, that is book, I think, number 34, 35?
Something like that. Too many.
Well, I think it was said both of Varro, the grammarian, and of Augustine of Hippo, that they wrote so much it was a wonder they had any time to read, and they read so much it was a wonder they had any time to write.
Right.
And I think that's definitely something that one might say of Richard. Coming from Lincoln's Inn, as some of you will know, I was fascinated in the introduction, Richard, to because I don't pretend I'm not an expert on Herbert at all. I'm very much someone learning from Richard's book. And so I was interested to see thinking about his life, to discover that actually John Donne, our great hero at the inn, and one of my predecessors there, would have known his mother and been part of that sort of dinner party society, perhaps even.
Yes, well, I'm glad you mentioned George Herbert's mother, first of all. Mothers should always come first, and there's no doubt about it that George Herbert's mother was a hugely significant figure. George Herbert was the 7th of 10 children, so she had all the children to bring up, but she was an extremely cultivated, intelligent woman who was the center of a kind of salon of artistic people, of poets who used to come and read at her house, including John Donne. So George Herbert met Donne when he was young, and George Herbert's mother not only sheltered Donne on many occasions, actually supported him financially. She was a wonderful woman, clearly, and it's not surprising that when George Herbert was at school, he wrote her a very long poem in Latin, praising all her virtues. So you can't underestimate what a wonderful woman she was, intelligent and devout, and brought George Herbert up to be both very learned and also very devout.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that struck me was his aristocratic background.
Yeah.
I mean, coming from having been in Salisbury for a number of years with Derrick when he was dean, and Bemerton and George Herbert were very much venerated there, and I was interested that actually here is an aristocrat by origin, and here is someone whom we remember as a parish priest, but was actually only a parish priest for just a few years at the very end of his life.
Yes, he came from a very aristocratic background. He belonged to the Norman Welsh aristocracy. He lived or the family home was at Montgomery Castle in Montgomery, what was the capital of Montgomeryshire, is now part of Powys. He was related both to the Earl of Carnarvon in the north of Wales and the Earl of Pembroke in the south of Wales. So it was an extremely distinguished family. And of course, coming from that background, he would have been expected to become a senior court figure, an ambassador or something like that. And as I think will emerge as we talk, it was quite a wrestle for him to actually contemplate doing something as lowly and despised as becoming a parish priest, because it was as less fashionable to be a parish priest at that time as it is now. And as I think will emerge, he had quite a sort of struggle about coming from that background with huge expectations that he would at least be an ambassador like his brother. But anyway, he felt God was calling him to something different.
But, I mean, that came from a crisis, really, didn't it?
Yes, he did go through a major crisis, and people do go through crises, and crises do significantly change people's lives very often. He went up to Cambridge when he was 17, hugely successful academically, and he was very quickly made a fellow of his college, Trinity College, Cambridge. Some of you will know it, that wonderful great quad they have at Trinity. And he became the public orator. The public orator's job was to do great formal speeches in Latin, and he made the formal oration for the visit of James I to Cambridge, and also a formal oration to Charles I when he came. So if he wasn't going to be an ambassador, he at least could have stayed on and been a very, very distinguished academic. But he had a period of illness. It appears now he perhaps suffered from TB or something all his life, so he never had very good health. Two of his brothers died, and that really shook him up. James I, who was his patron, died. A couple of his other patrons died. Now, I think he'd started to think about ordination before this, because he'd been in touch with his father-in-law, a very generous, good man, about the possibility of studying some divinities, he thought. But it was this kind of crisis which made him go into a sort of period of recluse for a bit, to try to rethink his whole life. And clearly that was a time of great trying to think through what he should really be doing.
Yeah, I mean, I was really struck by in a way, the way death features in this, people dying around him, and by his own early death, certainly by our standards and even by then.
Yeah.
And I mean, partly because I'm more used, if you like, to John Donne. Donne was definitely totally preoccupied with death, and you can see that by the way, I mean, if you look at the statue in St. Paul's in his funeral garb, as it were. And I wondered how far you thought that had influenced, I mean, because it's a very different sense in Herbert's poetry. At one level, it's much lighter, but there is a preoccupation with sin.
Yes, yes.
And how much, in that sense, it related to that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right that Herbert was not as preoccupied with death as John Donne was. Funnily enough, this morning I was reading through Donne, his famous poem on death, and it is a quite amazing piece of prose. It was part of one of his sermons. No, George Herbert wasn't preoccupied with death like John Donne, though he might well have been, because people did die very young in those days. Life expectancy was short. He died in 1633 at the age of 39. It was the time of the plague, and thousands and thousands of people died as a result of the plague. I give the figures in my book. I won't quote them now, but Lancelot Andrews, when he was a parish priest in London, in his parish in the centre of London, something like 6,000-7,000 of his parishioners died, a huge percentage of the pop. So death was all around him, but Herbert wasn't preoccupied by death, but he was preoccupied about bringing his life fully and totally under the grace of God. And he was very conscious of the ways that he failed in doing that. And he struggled all his life to try to do that. That, I think, was his preoccupation. To put it quite simply, to be a good follower of Jesus Christ, a good human being. That, I think, was what his main preoccupation was.
I mean, I think I'd want to say two things there. One is that I didn't expect it when I looked at the book, but the introduction is really important. because it gives all that context of his life, which, I mean, I don't know about you, but I find it very easy to look at poems skipping over that kind of bit. But it actually helped me a lot looking at it. But also the title, Richard, Wounded I Sing, I mean, in a way captures some of what you were saying about Herbert's sense of wanting to follow Christ, but also falling short.
Yeah, yeah.
And it comes from one. I mean, was it the particular line, or was it the poem that struck you there?
I think it was. It was a combination of the line, which I think is a wonderful, wonderful line. Wounded I sing, but also because it so much fits Herbert's life and the struggles that he had. I mean, he was an ambitious man, and he had to come to terms with the fact that his original ambitions were not going to be fulfilled and that God wanted him to do something much more humble. Walton, who wrote the life of Herbert, says about him at some point that this is, I mentioned before, the time of his retirement. He went when he went apart to try to rethink his life. And Walton writes about it in these terms: in this time of retirement, he had many conflicts with himself, whether he should return to the plaintive pleasures of court life or betake himself to the study of divinity and enter into sacred orders, to which his dear mother had often persuaded him. These were such conflicts as they only can know that have endured them, for ambitious desires and the outward glory of this world are not easily laid aside. But at last God inclined him to put on a resolution to serve God at his altar. It's very powerful, that, isn't it? And so true. And it goes really to the heart of Herbert's life and the struggle that he had and how much that he rebelled against it. But what he came to what he discovered in that poem which you've quoted, Joseph's Coat, it begins, "Wounded I sing, tormented I indite." But then it goes on the theme of Joseph's coat, and you remember Joseph's coat of many, many colours. And what Herbert is suggesting in the poem is that one of the colours of that coat is actually grief and sorrow. And it ends up, one of joy's coats, ticing it with relief to linger in me, and together languish. I live to show his power, who once did bring my joys to weep, and now my griefs to sing. So that last line, my joy, God at once avoid my joys to weep. In other words, he was a man who had everything going for him, and suddenly it all sort of crumbled away. His joys had left him, and he wept. But now, as he's ending up, but now my griefs to sing. And for him, that the griefs that are singing are one of the colours in this many splendid coat of Joseph. So that's the poem called Joseph's Coat.
And I think, I mean, I found, you talking about that and reading what you've written, that the idea of that woven into the cloak, I mean, it's a bit for me like the image of the risen Christ, that the marks of the nails are still there on the on the palm and in the side.
Yes.
That actually the Wounded I Sing is about the glories of the resurrection and risen life, but it is actually saying it includes all that. It's not denied.
Yeah.
But what's your favourite poem, Richard?
Well, I've got a lot of.
I think we disagree on this.
Well, I've got a lot of favourites, but I think one of them is called The Collar. Let me just find that in the book, because this brings out another aspect of it that I want to bring out, and it links again with John Donne. John Donne was also a person who rebelled against this calling to ordination. And there's a very famous poem by John Donne which begins with the phrase, "Batter my heart, three-personed God." And it ends up with a very extraordinary image, which we could hardly use today, about God wanting God to come to ravish him. So, the conventional picture is that you have this powerful figure, John Donne, rebelling against the call to ordination, and George Herbert kind of quietly, passively accepting it. But that's a false antithesis, a false contrast, because Herbert also had these terrible struggles which emerge in a lot of his poetry. And one of them is the collar in particular, which begins, "I struck the board and cried, 'No more, I will abroad.' What? Shall I ever sigh and pine? My life's and lie are free, free as the road, loose as the wind, as large as store. Shall I be still in suit?" And he goes on throughout the poem, rebelling against in those kind of tumultuous terms. And in the end, he sort of says to himself, he'll get away from these self-imposed bands, this prison that he's created from himself. And then the poem ends, "But as I raved and grew more fierce and wild at every word, methought I heard one calling, 'Child,' and I replied, 'My Lord.'" Again, I think one of the things that poem brings out is that very often the poems are a dialogue between God and himself. And this is particularly true, I think, of what was George Herbert's favourite poem, and also I think it's yours, Sheila. So you tell us what about your favourite poem?
I'm sure many of you know it. I've always loved "Love Bade Me Welcome," and it's just. I think.
Why don't you read it first, or one of us should read it?
Okay, I'm happy to read it if I can find it.
Page 59.
Thank you. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. "A guest," I answered, "worthy to be here." Love said, "You shall be he." I, the unkind, ungrateful? Ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand, and smiling did reply, "Who made the eyes but I?" "Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve." "And know you not," says Love, "who bore the blame?" "My dear, then I will serve." "You must sit down," says Love, "and taste my meat." So I did sit and eat. I think I've always found it one of the most accessible of Herbert's poems. Some of them I find quite inaccessible, whereas it seems to me that the dialogue is immediately clear. I think it's Simone Weil who calls it the most beautiful poem in the world. And I think there is a real sense of that being true, and that sense of God that comes through in terms of just the sheer amazement of what's being offered to the individual or to humanity as represented here. I think I was quite interested in your commentary that, you were referring back to his mother and to hospitality, so that the image is one of hospitality. I think that's also biblical, and I think there's a lot of biblical imagery in Herbert's poems. It's quite subtle sometimes. We heard it in the last one. We heard the reference to the Old Testament to the Hebrew Scriptures, with the call of God to the child. And so I think looking, I mean, sort of listening to this when I hear it or when I read it, I think it's the hospitality image, the image of the Eucharist, all that is immediately there in it. And I suppose particularly thinking of John's Gospel in that sense, which doesn't actually have the bread and the wine, but does have that sense of love as the point of it all. I think where I parted company with you, and this is about, never go and see a film of a book because you've got your own picture of it, which was that I was heading to the Vermeer painting that has very few people there. And so when you were talking about his mother and dinner parties, I was thinking, no, I'm not going to a dinner party and saying, I'm not worthy to be here when there's a room full of people here. This is more like one of those more austere Vermeer paintings, which I think John Drury compares it to, where there are very few people in the room. Because it also feels very intimate to me. It's actually...
It is very... I didn't realise that I implied that this was a huge dinner party. I know that I think certainly not more than 8 at the maximum.
Oh, right. I had 2 or possibly 3.
Yeah. It's just W.H. Auden in his wonderful poem where he writes a poem about every room in the house, and when it comes to the dining room, he talks about the ideal dinner party being 8. No, I think you and I agree that's too many. We want something more intimate than that. But as you say, there's the hospitality element, because his family were all very hospitable, and when he became a parish priest, hospitality in the parish for him was a very important thing. He encouraged his parishioners to offer hospitality to one another, because he said that, if there are tensions and quarrels in the parish, nothing is better to overcome that than some hospitality. But also, as you bring out, of course, it is an image of the Eucharist, and the Eucharist itself is a foretaste of the heavenly banquet. But it's just wonderful the way the dialogue consists of a sort of a drawing back, and then a reassurance, and a hesitation, and then a reaching out all the way through. Sort of the initiative being taken by God, the person, the other side, always hesitant and reluctant, but God persisting right to the end. And I think there's a particularly sort of subtle bit, I think, in the last line of that poem, because, the third last time, you see, we have the bit about the eyes. Truth, Lord, but I have more than let my shame go where it does. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. Now, some people think that those are the words of God, I will serve, like Christ who said, I am amongst you as one who serve. I actually think that it is George Herbert himself. He's in fact saying, all right, I will come to the dinner party, but I'll only come if I serve you. There are some people, it may sound a rather trivial example, but sometimes you actually have the humility to allow other people to do something for you. It's a trivial example, but when I was Bishop of Oxford, I always used to insist on carrying my cold case everywhere, big heavy case of all my clerical clothing. And eventually I realized I had to have the humility to let my chaplain carry it. But it's the same sort of thing, Herbert's saying, all right, I will come, but I'll come and serve you. But in contrast to that, you must sit down. In contrast to this, you must sit down. It's to sit down in contrast to the serving. There are all sorts of wonderful sort of subtleties in all the poems, and some of them are difficult. And they do take quite a lot of close reading and attention to them. Do we want to talk a little bit about its parish, perhaps? And
well, I mean, other than going to Bemerton, I don't know very much about, at one level, about his life as a parish priest. I mean, what I do know is that there are those very powerful images, you know, which appear particularly in the hymns that have come about, you know, sweeping out a room as for thy sake, which strike me as sort of, you know, they are wonderful sentiments about how you might actually shape your life, all of it, the good and the bad, towards God. I'm not sure about what kind of image of being a parish priest it gives for us today. I mean, I wondered if you'd like to say something about what it meant then.
Well, first of all, it was a tiny parish, just on the outskirts of Salisbury. It suited him in one way because he was very, as you know, Herbert was very musical, and he played both the lute and the viol, and he loved to go to Salisbury Cathedral on a Sunday evening and listen to the music, and then on the way back he'd join a quartet and play himself with his friends, and of course he composed music as well as wrote poems, so it was very well placed from that point of view. But it was a tiny parish. He felt the responsibility of it very, very heavily, even there were so few souls there. And you may perhaps know that every day he used to gather not just his family, but as many as the village as possible for daily morning and evening prayer. Every day, twice a day, the bell would ring, and quite a lot of the village, as well as his family, would gather for morning and evening prayer. He wanted to create the whole village as a kind of religious community, very much along the lines of his friend Nicholas Ferrer at Little Gidding, who did exactly the same thing. So prayer was at the heart of his life, and he lived the life was what was the kind of ideal for a country parson, really, until the 1960s, 1970s. You would have one priest per parish. The parish would spend his morning studying and praying. The afternoon would be visiting, and then the evening would perhaps be either entertaining or out entertained. Because that way of life has totally, totally gone. I mean, out in the country areas now, of course, one parish is looking on for 8 or 9 parishes, scootling from one place to another. It's very lucky if a parish priest can find any time to read or study. So a very different kind of ministry has to be found for today. There's a wonderful story about when he was first instituted to the parish. He locked the doors, and the church wardens outside looked through the window into the church where Herbert was, and they found him spread-eagled on the floor with his hands out like that and his face to the altar in the posture known as the proskynesis, totally, as it were, offered to God, when he, as it were, made some final symbolic offering of his life and his life as a parish priest to God. Although John Drury pawns a little bit of skepticism on that. John Drury is a very good friend of mine who wrote the best book on George Herbert, but he's inclined to be skeptical about these, and I'm a little bit more gullible, I think, to these good stories of holy people. But what we shouldn't forget is that he decided as a parish priest he had to be married, and he had a wonderful father-in-law. Not only did he have a wonderful mother, his father died very young, but his mother remarried a wonderful man who was very, very supportive of George Herbert. And his father-in-law introduced George Herbert to a woman that he thought was very suitable, and they got married 3 days after they were introduced. Well, that's a little bit quicker than even Joe and I, and we got married pretty quickly. But there's a famous writer at that time called John Audrey, who was actually a relative of his wife. And John Audrey wrote, "His marriage, I suppose, hastened his death." He goes on to say, "My kinsman was a handsome Bonaroba and ingenious," and Audrey translates Bonaroba as wanton. And a modern definition is an attractive woman who is sexually available. But for Audrey at that time, and in that context, it would have meant lively or sportive. But the point it was a very, very happy marriage for the 3 years they had together. Sadly, they didn't have any children. But although she remarried, she never got over George Herbert and was singing his praises to the end of his life. But that's rather a nice picture, I think, of this Bonaroba, this lively
I'm not
women.
sure we should tangle on the subject of how women were stereotyped in earlier centuries.
No, maybe not. Maybe not. Do you want to take another poem of his? Another.
Well, I wondered if I could just say, one more thing about Love Bade Me Welcome, which was, I referred to Simone Weil, calling it the most beautiful poem in the world, and you will see in Richard's commentary that he refers to her love of the poem. But the thing I wanted to draw attention to was two things, really. One was that it spoke to her through her own suffering, because she suffered enormously in her life, both physically as well as mentally. And she got terrible migraine, and she used to recite it when she had one of them to herself. And, it said to me about God speaking to her, because it was at that point that, from a Jewish background, she had a sense of the whole question of Christian baptism. She never did get baptized, but that element of suffering or wounded, but also the fact that she used to she recited it, she just went on reciting it when she had a migraine. And it struck me, in a way we tend to read things, and we're used to the idea that we read silently. But actually, in some ways, that's a modern phenomenon.
Yeah.
And in the use of this book during Advent, there's a bit of me wants to say, actually, we ought to be reading this aloud, whether it's to ourselves or whether it's to one another.
That's an interesting thought, yes. No, I think I must try that. I haven't tried it, but I think probably one wants to read it quietly to oneself first, because actually to get the sort of feel of it, because some lines follow straight onto the other lines, other lines they need to pause. But then after having read it quietly to oneself and taken in a little bit of the sense, to actually read it aloud and get the music of it, because there's so much music in these poems. It's very often said that poetry is akin to music in many ways, and certainly that is very true of Herbert. He experimented with all sorts of different kinds of verse. There's no one set form of verse. There's not all sort of iambic pentameters. It's a whole different forms but different forms of musicality. Just on the Simone Weil. Simone Weil was one of the most remarkable people in the 20th century, brilliant philosopher, more original than almost anybody I have read. As Sheila said, that when she was in a monastery and reading this, and as she put it, as she was reading, Christ came down and took possession of my soul. She had a very, very powerful mystical experience of Christ taking hold of her as she read that poem.
And as you know, one of the things that intrigued me was that you'd chosen the book to do the book for Advent rather than Lent.
Yeah.
Partly, the sense of Herbert's sense of sin had made me think, well, doesn't it match Lent more?
Yeah.
Advent is, of course, a penitential season, but we don't tend to think of it so much like that. We're too busy eating lots of Christmas mince pies to take that in.
Yes. Well, there are other pragmatic reasons for this book being an Advent book. First of all, Mark Oakley has written a very good book, George Herbert in Lent, so there wasn't scope for another one. Secondly, we actually tried it out in the parish with a Lent group, and with a bit of readjustment of different poems, I could make it a Lent book, and it ends up with a Christmas poem. But actually, it's a book you can use at any time, because it takes themes which are pretty fundamental to Christian faith. Both Advent and Lent are times for preparation, and the book, I think, is can be used for preparation, but it can be used at any time. But I do think that it's not a book to be hurried through. It's designed to be read in terms of one poem a day and not more. And I think it is a mistake to hurry through. Yeah, in fact, Sheila, you were saying...
Yes, I would, again, sorry, I'm disagreeing with... I think it's actually one poem a week, so this will actually last you much longer.
Yeah.
It's a very good value book. It will last you much longer than you think.
Yeah.
Because I think there is something about actually living with one of these poems for the whole week and taking that as the theme and you know, reading it out loud or reading it to someone, talking with someone about it, praying about it silently. I mean, I think that there is so much in each of these that it will last you at least a week, if not a lifetime.
Well, that is absolutely, I'll try to take that to heart, yes. I mean, taking something in depth, what in the church circles are called lectio divina, so that actually you really allow the words to sink in and permeate your whole being. I'd quite like just to tell people a little bit about The Pulley, if that's all right, which is one of my favourite poems. I think I might read it, if that's all right. When God at first made man, having a glass of blessing standing by, let us, said he, pour on him all we can. Let the world's riches, which dispersed lie, contract into a span. So strength first made a way, then beauty flowed, then wisdom, honour, pleasure. When almost all was out, God made us stay, perceiving that, alone of all his treasure, rest in the bottom lay. For if I should, said he, bestow this jewel also on my creature, he would adore my gifts instead of me, and rest in nature, not the God of nature. So both should losers be. Yet let him keep the rest, but keep them with repining restlessness. Let him be rich and weary, that at least, if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast. I think that I absolutely love that poem. So you've got this idea of God with a glass, not just a glass of drinking glass, I think with a great big sort of fruit bowl, God pouring into this all the good things of life, except for one thing, peace of mind, peace of heart, so that human beings are left with a fundamental restlessness. So God lets God have all these gifts, except that final peace of heart, in case human beings forget God because of all these good things. But they won't forget God because there's still this restlessness there. And he doesn't use the word the pulley in the poem. It's called the pulley, but the pulley doesn't appear. But the pulley is the image of it. If you think of a wheel with a rope going on it, with a bucket on one end of the rope and a bucket at the end of the other end of the rope, and one of the buckets is full and one of the buckets is empty. So what will happen is that the full bucket will come smashing down on the ground, the empty bucket will fly up. So that's the image of himself. He's thinking that if we're kind of feeling empty and restless, we will actually be whipped up to God out of our restlessness. And of course, behind it is that great phrase of St. Augustine, thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. That's obviously behind that poem. But I think that poem is lovely, the way it communicates very, very directly with a very, very kind of unusual, a rather startling image.
I know his poems weren't published until he was dying, had died, and were not published by him. I mean, was the title given to it by Herbert, given it doesn't appear in the poem?
No, yes, that title was given, yes.
Yeah.
George Herbert wrote poems all his life. Interestingly, most of the poems he wrote are in Latin. And I don't know any of you heard of it, and if you didn't, it's well worth getting on BBC Sounds. They start the week with Mervyn Bragg last week on George Herbert. It was absolutely brilliant. They had 3 wonderful people. And what that brought out was the extent of his Latin poetry, which is a huge amount. And actually, the Latin poetry with the translation is available in the Penguin version of George Herbert's poems. But in terms of the English poetry, quite a lot of the poetry was written before the end of his life, and that's normally called by the scholars little W. W is the collection of poems that he wrote during the course of his life. And then right at the end of his life, he sent what was at that stage a final version to his friend Nicholas Ferrer at Little Gidding. And he said to Nicholas Ferrer, will you please take these? If you don't think they're any use, please burn them. If you think they might be of some help to people, please help them. Well, thank goodness Nicholas Ferrer, of course, recognized their worth and kept them. And they've been in print ever since. They've always been popular. And one of the interesting features about him, and this was well brought out by Melvyn Bragg, is that all shades of churchmanship in the Church of England have liked the poems. Anglo-Catholics, Puritans like Richard Baxter. It's been very, very mainstream because it goes really to the very heart of what it is to be a Christian, to seeking to bring one's life before the grace of God and respond as fully as possible. I think that's why it's appealed right across the spectrum.
As one who was sceptical about Herbert as a book for Advent rather than Lent, I thought Richard had actually given me a sop. The very last two poems which are put together are called Christmas. And so there is one about Christmas. And I was really struck in those with the way you get you almost get St. John's Gospel, St. Luke's Gospel, St. Luke's Gospel, St. John's Gospel, because it's playing with the Johannine images of the light of Christ, of God becoming human, of the incarnation that we get in the prologue of John, which would have been read then as now at Christmas, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And then you can see it move into the infancy narratives, the tales of the birth with the animals appearing that we get in Luke. And then coming back to that concept of the light that goes on during the darkness of the incarnation. And so in just two sonnets, you've got you've got the whole of two gospels there in their absolute.
But there's also a very, very original image in the first of those two Christmas poems, because it begins with a person going out hunting and getting lost. And because they're getting lost, they don't know where they are, they have to go into the local inn. They go into the local inn and they find Christ waiting for them. And it's a kind of image of somebody riding and, as it were, losing themselves in life, losing themselves and then finding themselves and finding Christ within them. So here's this wonderful capacity to bring out these, combined biblical themes, as you have rightly said. And there's a lot of sort of hidden biblical images in the poem. In the one that I read before about the collar, about the rebellion one, I struck the board and cried. There's kind of hidden biblical imagery all the way through that. The board that he strikes is the altar. There's a reference to the wine. There's a reference to the bread. So there's so much there in those poems that can be teased out.
And they would have known their Bible better than us.
I hope so.
No, it is that thing about when people of the time came to things, how different it was for people then compared with ours, and therefore where it's important to get some of the resonances. It's not just an academic exercise.
Do you think we start to open out to what people might, unless there's anything else you want to tease out? So could we have any comments you'd like to make or any questions you'd like to ask? And Andrew, you've got a microphone, Andrew, there. There's usually a little sort of quiet period at this time, isn't there? Yes.
You'll have to read another poem. You'll have to read another poem.
All right. Let me... well, first of all, I'll give you my favorite line of... I won't read the whole poem, but it's my favorite line of Herbert of all. In the poem called The Flower, page 90. This is a very sort of stock image, and nothing very original about the image. He compares his life to a flower that that when things are going well, it's like it's sort of blossoming. When your life is bad, it's like the bulb underground. And he compares all the moods of his life when he's feeling on top of the world and when he's feeling very, very down. And then he comes at the end to say, "And now in age I bud again. After so many deaths I live and write. I once more smell the dew and rain and relish versing." I think those are my favorite lines of Herbert. And now in age, if there's anybody feeling old here, take this to heart, will you? "And now in age I bud again. After so many deaths I live and write. I once more smell the rain, the dew and rain, and relish versing." A man fully, fully alive, after all the despondency and the gloom and the despair and the illnesses, suddenly to feel like that. Those, I think, are my favorite lines.
But they're also about a mystical seeing, aren't they? I mean, I'm thinking of Stritz Blake, isn't it? To see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower.
Yeah.
It's about telling us to look and in that sense see, as well as the joy of rediscovering it.
Yes, I think you're right. One other feature of most people are thinking of any questions they want to ask or points they want to make. One other feature which hasn't emerged so far in our conversation, which I think is rather unusual. Herbert had this struggle with his ambition. We've talked about that. But he also had a real struggle about how, or indeed whether, he should use his poetic gifts in praise of God. He had no problem about music. He knew that if he wrote music, he could write hymns, and these would be directly in the praise of God. But how could he use all his poetic talents in the praise of God? Wouldn't this just be a kind of showing off? He wrote to his mother when he was a teenager, and when he just got to Cambridge at the age of 17, to say that he didn't want to write love poetry. He wanted to write poetry in praise of God. So he knew that what he wanted to do. And of course, everybody else was writing love poetry. John Donne wrote love poetry. Everybody was writing love poetry. That was the kind of poetry you were. But he wanted to write poetry, love poetry to God. But if you think about it, how can you do that without actually showing off your brilliant talent as a poet? Wouldn't that be a bit sort of vainglorious? And he said that he sought simplicity. He wanted to be simple, but then somehow he managed to achieve to use all his poetic skills in the end to say something very simple and straightforward, as we see, for example, in that poem and hymn which ends up, "My God and King." What could be simpler and more straightforward and more wonderful than that, just to say, "My God and King"? But actually he's used all his poetic ingenuity and his poetic talent in order to get at that point. Yes, Richard.
I just go back to the description you gave about the flower and ending up with the bud. And that reminded me of something I heard, I think it's on Melbourne.
Do we want a microphone?
Thank you. No, I was wanting to refer you back, referring back to your description of the flower, and you spoke about how at the end it was the bud, and that reminded me of what I'd heard from Melvyn Bragg's program last week, when there had been a reference to the fact that at his death there was some thought that he had actually been singing at his death. And I was just thinking of like the pinnacle of his life. And the bud was like coming through and also the simplicity that he wanted to then express himself to God, but singing.
Singing. No, thank you for mentioning that, and that came out very well in Melvyn Bragg's program, which I didn't mention in the book, rather wish I had. That as he was dying, he was singing, I think probably singing a hymn or song in praise of God, which he had written himself. It's a wonderful image, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't it? Yes, absolutely amazing.
Thank you for your conversation today. I only want to make a comment. It's not really a question, and it's something about my own understanding of Herbert, which is slight. But what has really grasped me about Herbert's poetry is his kind of almost visceral grasp of what it is to struggle. And the poem Love Bade Me Welcome, of course, is just that drawing back in the face of love and in the face of beauty and in the face of all the riches in the world, but the drawing back and the sense of trepidation, which I think we all struggle with.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's connected in my mind with, of course, Jacob's wrestling with the angel.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to be speaking to it this way, yeah. I'm revealing my ignorance. This has been an absolute revelation, and in fact it came from Melvin Bragg's program. So the question is, why have I never heard of George Herbert before? I know about all the great poets, or those that are popularly known as the great poets. And I've never, I mean, he's clearly an absolutely outstanding, brilliant man. Is that a surprise to anyone else that they hadn't heard more about this amazing man before? Or is it just my ignorance?
I think people tend to be brought up on the romantics, don't they? I mean, if people at school are introduced to anything, it'll usually be the romantics. Sort of Wordsworth and Shelley and Byron and Keats, and above all Keats, of course. That's most, certainly in the past, that was most people's way into poetry. It was T.S. Eliot in the early 20th century who really brought what are called the metaphysical poets much more to the fore. T.S. Eliot was a great champion of Herbert, as he was of Donne, though actually I think he preferred Herbert to Donne. So Eliot was responsible for bringing Herbert a little bit more to the fore, but you're quite right. He is a devotional poet, and people are not necessarily drawn to devotional poetry. And he's not as such as an obviously dramatic poet as John Donne. John Donne does have more popular appeal, doesn't he?
Well, and I think the other side of Donne's life has made him, you know, he was not always the clergyman. He was, and so, but I also, I mean, I actually asked, when I was looking at Richard's book first, I asked myself the question of when did I first come across George Herbert's poems? And because in fact, like you, I would say I don't think I came across them at the same time as others, at school or university or wherever. And I think it was actually through his hymns that I found them. And it was actually through them being sung in churches that I attended. And so I think there is something about Herbert. I don't know whether it's that he's been cast more into a religious angle, and therefore or that the story of an aristocratic younger man has not had the appeal that some of the others have had. And it's to our loss if we don't know them, I think.
But just to continue that a little bit, you said the Oxford book of English poetry, massive term.
Yeah.
When I looked at my recent ones, there was only just a couple from her.
Yes.
All these other people, maybe 5, 6,
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just following on from that, did he write any non-devotional poetry? either in English or Latin?
Some of his Latin poetry is non-devotional. There's quite a lot of his Latin poetry is defending features of the Church of England against Roman Catholics on the one hand and Puritans on the other. There's the long poem, as I mentioned, that he wrote in Latin to his mother, and the various other poems that he wrote, rather more polemical poems. He didn't write any ordinary human love poetry, and I think of his English poetry, I think English poetry is all devotional poetry. I think there's one before we finish. I think there's just one feature that I know Sheila was keen to bring out, and I think might be very useful. One of the features of Herbert's poetry modern people find very difficult is this emphasis upon falling short of God, what in old-fashioned terms used to be called sin, which people today find very difficult because we're all encouraged to think well of ourselves and not to beat ourselves up too much. You've got a view about this, Sheila.
You see, I'm less. It probably means that I'm not quite as confident as the bishop here. I think I don't find that, because I think there is a natural affinity when people are honest with themselves, maybe in their own room, that actually we do fall short. And therefore I've never found that side of, guilty of dust and sin in Love Bade Me Welcome. I've never found that side odd, but it's equally that, as it happens, where I minister at the moment in Lincoln's Inn, we use the Book of Common Prayer the whole time. And so unlike you, I think I'm very happy with the longer confession in the Book of Common Prayer and reciting that, and the fact that it might seem to some people to be dinning that in, but actually I think it does resonate, and I hesitate to compare things, but I wouldn't say that people in the world today are utterly confident. I think that there's an important thing that's come through about getting rid of a blame culture. But I don't think the Christian story is about a blame culture. I think it's about that honesty and discovery. Yes. About the ways, about the distance between us and love and us and God. Yes. And so I don't. So long as you don't associate sin with a blame culture, then I'm all for saying yes. It's time we got down on our knees more and thought about it.
Yeah, and certainly Herbert has a very, very strong self-awareness of himself and his motivations. There are all sorts of wonderful, vivid phrases where he looks into his heart, and what he sees there is a quarry of piled vanities. What a powerful phrase, a quarry of piled vanities. And another phrase from another, he looks into his mind, and what he sees there is a casket of daggers. Very, very acute sense of self-awareness. So I think we ought to stop there, Andrew.
Richard, thank you. Yes, well, fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I'm a bit with Chris in terms of, not being so aware of Herbert. So, Chris, thank you very much for raising that. And Sheila, thank you very much for coming and interviewing Richard and giving your own perspectives on many of those poems. It's a great book. Advent is coming up, so you must have it. Venetia at the back would be very pleased to sell you one. And Richard, I think, would be very pleased to sign the book at this table. Again, thank you very much, and please thank Sheila Watson and Richard Harris.
Can I just thank Sheila for coming and sharing with me, and also thank you very much for being here tonight, and to thank Andrew once again, without whom nothing like this would ever happen.
And do have a drink if you'd like to have one. Thank you.
I think we covered most of what we intended to.
Great. Sheila, thank you very much.
Yes, please, that would be nice. A glass of white, please.
White, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much.
Can I
Oh, yes.
take that off?